I'm going to take a guess here that not one of you listening to this video has never visited a website before. Actually, that's probably a pretty safe assumption to make, since you'd have to have visited the Winstructor website to download this video. So, since we all know what a website is, the next step in managing your own website is to obtain a suitable web serving application. Well, hosting and serving up websites is the most common function of IIS, as it allows you to publish websites that can be accessed either on the internet or internally from an intranet. The World Wide Web, or the www service, is the service that allows both static and dynamic content to be published to your target audience. Now, when we first installed IIS 7 using the server role wizard in the first video in this series, it automatically created a default website. So let's go and take a quick look at it. So to view this site, we'll first need to open up the Internet Information Services console by clicking on Start. We'll go to Administrative Tools, and then we'll select the IIS Manager, and we'll be launching the version 7 manager here, not the version 6 one. So over here on the left, we'll expand our first server, which is called SO5, and then we'll expand Sites, and here you can see our default website. Now, this default website is, as you would expect, a website which is installed by default, and you can use this default website structure to build your own website and change it as you see fit. Now, IIS uses two types of directories: home directories and virtual directories. And we'll talk about both of these types of directories in this video, but let's first cover what home directories are. Now, home directories are the central location where your published files are stored. So if we go and open up Windows Explorer, and we'll go to our C drive, and then this folder here called inetpub, which many of you would be familiar with from working with previous versions of IIS. Now, inside here is this other folder called www.root, and it's this folder that forms the root of your default website. Now, and this is as simple as it gets really. You can drop your web pages into this home directory and they're ready to be accessed by your favorite internet browser. So to illustrate this, by default, there are already a couple of files here in this folder, this IIS start web page, and we have a welcome image. Now, if we just double click this IIS start web page, it opens up with Internet Explorer, and you can see the Welcome to IIS image that's being displayed here. So let's go and close Internet Explorer again, and we'll open it up. And this time we're going to navigate to the name of this server, which is simply SO5. And as you can see, it fires up the exact same page. It's just pulled our default page from our www root directory and then displayed it inside our browser. Pretty easy stuff, really. Now, we also can nest directories within our home folder as well, exactly like you would with regular folders and subfolders on your Windows operating system. So coming back to Windows Explorer, if we right click here inside our www root directory, we'll create a new folder and we'll give it a name of subdir for a subdirectory. Now, inside this folder, we'll just copy our two default files here, our IIS start and our welcome image. I'm just going to drag and drop them while I hold down the control key, and that'll copy those files into that folder. And if we open that, you can see those two files there inside that folder. Okay, so what we've just done is to create a subdirectory that lives within the root of our website. So let's go back to Internet Explorer, and we're going to navigate to SO5 subdir, and there we can see the exact same page as before. However, if we try and access a page that doesn't exist, then let's just add an extension at the end here. Let's just say test.htm. We'll hit enter. And you can see that we get a 404 or file not found error, and that's because that page doesn't actually exist. Now, similarly, if we go back to Internet Explorer here, and we'll go back to our www root folder, we'll create another folder here, and I'm going to call this one subdir2. And we'll go back to Internet Explorer and we'll type in subdir2 and we'll hit enter. And again, we get another error message, but it's a different error since we attempted to access a directory and not a specific page. IIS 7 by default throws up this 403 error telling us that we don't have permission to browse the directory contents. So for those of you that are playing around with IIS for the first time, you'll understand now how a directory structure works. It's basically the same as what you'd expect to see in Windows Explorer on your own hard drive, except here your directories are simply referencing a path in a URL. Now, creating directories like we've just done underneath our root folder here, that's certainly one way of creating a website hierarchy. Another way is using a virtual directory. Now, it's important to understand though, a virtual directory doesn't have to be located under our home directory here. It can live anywhere you like. So what is a virtual directory? A virtual directory is simply a directory that can be placed almost anywhere, but it appears to a user that it's directly part of the website path. So let's illustrate what I mean. We'll go back to our console and we'll right click on our default website and we'll choose to add a virtual directory. Now in IIS 6, if you're familiar with IIS 6, it used to start up a wizard there, but now the process has changed a bit and it's been massaged into the one window that you see here. And in fact, that's actually true with a lot of things that you used to do with wizards in IIS 6. They're now single windows like this one. So the first thing we'll need to do is give our directory an alias, which is simply a name that users are going to type in. It's going to appear to be a subdirectory. So for the sake of the argument, I'm just going to call this one virtual. Now next we'll need to provide a path to a physical directory. Now this can be a UNC path pointing to a share on a different computer if you like, but I'm just going to create a new directory at the root of my C drive, which is obviously not going to be within the path of my root home directory. So we'll click the little browse icon here, and on my C drive I'll choose to make a new folder. I'll call this folder data, and we'll click OK. And the final thing we should do here before we click on OK is to verify that we can in fact connect to the new directory, since it's not going to work if we don't have permissions to access that data folder we just created here. So if we click Connect As, we can either connect using the default pass-through authentication, or we could specify an account that will always be used to access the data folder. So for the sake of this demo, let's use our administrator's account. So we'll click on the Set button, and we'll type in the username of administrator, and we'll enter in the password for the administrator account, and we'll need to type that in again to confirm it, and then we'll click on OK and OK again. Now we can click the Test Settings button to verify that we can access the folder, and since we have two green ticks here, that indicates that we do have permission, so we're good to go. Alright, we'll click OK, and here we can see our virtual directory has been created, but inside IIS it's called virtual, yet it points to a folder on our C drive called data. And of course, this data folder sits outside our root home directory, which of course is in our inet pub folder and www.root. So what we'll do while we're here is let's take these two files that we've been using. I'm going to right click and choose copy, and we'll go and paste them inside our data folder. And now we'll go back to Internet Explorer and we'll enter in the path to the virtual folder, which is going to be so5/virtual, and we'll hit enter. And the page loads using this path, which of course isn't a real physical folder anywhere. We don't really have a folder called virtual at all. It's just an alias that points to our data folder. So virtual directories are really useful because they appear as though they are a physical subdirectory, yet they can be stored practically anywhere, such as a share on a remote computer that provides the content. Now, if you do want to change the properties of this virtual directory, we'll go over to our Internet Information Services console, and we'll need to select our virtual directory, and over on the right we'll choose Advanced Settings. And from this window you can change the folder or the authentication details right here if you need to. Alright, well, let's move on and we'll take a look at how we can add a new website to IIS. So we'll right click on Sites over on the left hand side of our console and we'll choose Add Website. And again, this here is another place where a single page has replaced a wizard we used to have in IIS 6, so it's a little different, but if you're at all familiar with IIS, you'll breeze through this anyway. So the first thing we'll need to do for our website here is to give it a name. So I'm going to call mine Winstructor. And as soon as we start typing in the name of our site, you'll also note that IIS will create an application pool using the same name. Although, if you already have an application pool you prefer to use, then you can click on the Select button and then choose your application pool from the drop-down list. Now, we'll look at application pools in later videos, but for now, trust me when I say that it's good that we're creating a new application pool for each new website, as this will make our overall server that's hosting our sites more reliable. Again, we'll have more on application pools in other videos. Now next, we'll need to choose where our data and pages for this site we're creating are going to live, so we'll click on the Browse icon here. And we'll need to create a new folder. Let's do it again on the root of my C drive. I'll call this one Winstructor, and we'll click OK. Now we can also connect to this folder using alternate credentials if we like, and we've seen that before, so we'll skip that for now. For the website bindings, we can choose from HTTP and HTTPS, and the difference, of course, is that HTTP uses port 80 by default, and HTTPS uses port 443. Now we can also tell this website to use all IP addresses on this server or just use a specific one if we do have more than one network card installed in this server. And finally, we can also choose to use a host header, which allows IIS to redirect requests for our websites to the correct site if we're hosting more than one site on this server. So I'm going to enter in www.winstructor.com. And we'll leave the default here to start this website immediately, and we'll click on OK. And there's the new site, which is now live and ready to start dishing out pages to our visitors. So now that our site is up and running, let's go and take a look at some of the common configuration settings you may want to work with. And although there's really little difference with what we'll see here in IIS 7 compared with IIS 6, but since everything's been moved around, it's still worth taking a quick look at where we can begin to find things inside this new console. Now first of all, when we select our website, over on the right hand side of the console under the Actions pane, we've got things like our basic settings, which allows us to change things like the path to the root folder for this website, as well as change things like our application pool as well. You'll also see that we do have options for stopping, starting and restarting this website. And down here under Advanced Settings, we can set things like the ID for this website, which is a unique identifier for this site, and it will be used for identifying this site in our logs and our trace files. Now we can see here, there's the physical path to our files that we have stored for this website. We can change that here if we like. Now if we are using alternate credentials to access the pages in this folder, you're going to see those listed here. Now under our behavior section, if we expand this out, you'll see that we can set connection limits for this website, and the connection timeout by default is 120 seconds, and that's not changed from IIS 6. So if a user's browser fails to close any open connections after it's finished with it, then this connection is ordinarily going to stay open indefinitely, and that'll take up server resources. So with this connection timeout setting of 120 seconds or 2 minutes, it'll force that connection to close. Now we could also set the maximum amount of bandwidth that we're going to allow this website to use, and that defaults to pretty much unlimited really. If I recall, this is about 4096 megabytes if my conversions are correct, which is far more bandwidth than I'll probably have in the next 10 years. And the second value here is the amount of concurrent connections that we'll allow to this website. And again, my server would probably have had a few heart attacks before it'll accept that sort of connections, but at least you know that IIS is good for some heavy lifting if you have some decent hardware. Now we can see that this server here is using HTTP only at this time, but we'd expect to see HTTPS here as well if we had chosen to enable it for this site. And finally, we could see whether failed request tracing is enabled, which by default it isn't, as evidenced by our false setting here. And this is something we can use to troubleshoot failures in our IIS applications. You see, in IIS 6, when a request came in, but it never came back out the pipeline, it was just lost in the system, so to speak. In IIS 7, we can have detailed logs which show us exactly what happened when a request came in, where it got stuck somewhere during the processing, and the end result of that request. So it's a really useful tool for troubleshooting your web applications, and definitely something we're going to talk about in another video. Now, the other configuration options I want to cover in this video exist in this middle part of the console, and this is where IIS 7 can look a little confusing at first glance. You see, in IIS 6, you could right click on your website itself and then choose Properties, and then run through all of the options that pertain to the website in question. Now, in IIS 7, when we select an object here on the left-hand side of the console, whether that be our entire server, or a website, or an FTP site, in the middle here, we have a whole bunch of areas of configuration that we'd normally expect to find floating around on one of the tabs of our Properties window. Now, since we don't work with websites or servers that way anymore, all of the configuration options pretty much exist right here in the middle of the window. Now, some of the options that you'll see here we're not going to cover in this video, as we will be looking at some of them in more depth in other videos. So if I seem to be skipping some in this video, you're going to know why. So the first thing I'm going to do here is up the top, I'm going to switch from an area view to a category view. For no other reason than I think it's a little easier to work with in this video, since I find the grouping of features to be more logical. So let's scroll down. We'll skip this application development and health and diagnostic sections at the moment, and we'll go down to HTTP features, and this is where we can configure things like our default document, directory browsing, error pages, any redirects, our HTTP response headers, and MIME types, just like we could in IIS 6. So our first option here is to set the default document, which, as it suggests, is where we can specify the name of a file which should be loaded when people hit the root of our website. So when a user hits our site, IIS is going to look inside the root folder for a file called default.htm, and it's going to show it to the user if that file exists. Now, if it doesn't exist, IIS will then check for a default.asp page, and it will show that to the user. If that doesn't exist, then IIS is going to move down this list, and it will keep trying each of these in order until it finds a file with one of these names. If it doesn't find any of these files, then it's just going to produce a 404 error. Now, the next option we have here is directory browsing, which just displays the contents of the folder in a Windows Explorer style file listing. Now, by default, this isn't enabled, but if you do want to use this feature, you will need to turn it on, which you can do by simply clicking the enable link over here on the right, and then you're able to specify which of these fields you want to see when people access the folders on your site. Now, our next item here is error pages, and here you can see a list of common error codes that you'll get when you experience errors on a website. So when a user surfs your website and encounters an error, in a lot of cases these error messages aren't all that informative. An example is when a user gets a 404 or page not found error. It'd be much nicer for the user to have a nice page telling them that their page they were looking for wasn't found, and perhaps offering a search feature or tips where they should be looking, or perhaps even a chance just to go back to the previous page or something like that, rather than just a dead-end page. So let's take this 404 or page not found error as an example. If we double click it, we can see that the default is for IIS to present the user with content from a static error file. And if we click on Start, and we'll open up our computer here, and we'll go to our C drive, inetpub, then the custom error folder here, finally the US English folder, you're going to see all of the error pages in here. And if we scroll down, we can see there's our standard 404 page. Let's fire that up, and this is what the user is going to see. And it's not really a user-friendly page for the average person, so you could quite easily insert a better page that makes your site much more user-friendly. So if we close Windows Explorer, we'll go back to our console here. We could alternatively execute a URL when the user, in this case, gets a page not found error, or we can even redirect the user to a different URL altogether. Now, we could also configure HTTP redirects, which enables us to redirect any requests to this site to a different location. And that's a really good feature for acquisitions, or when you have development going on your site and you need to shift users elsewhere for a short period of time. The next option we have is to configure HTTP response headers, and you can see here that we do only have one by default, and that's to identify ASP.NET as our code engine, but we can add in more if we like, and generally you probably won't make much use of this feature, but it is used to add information to the header that IIS normally sends to the client browser. So to add a custom header, we'd simply click the add link here and then type in the custom header name and the custom header value and then just click on OK. Now if we do click set common headers, in here is where we can configure HTTP keeper lives, which of course are enabled by default. And an HTTP keeper live is when the user's browser asks the server to keep open a connection for the client. Now because the connection remains open, the user's browser can ask for multiple things without having to re-establish a separate connection each time. So when we consider a typical web page, normally a page is going to contain text and images. It might even contain tables and frames and results from scripts and even dynamic content from databases or sometimes even other websites. Every separate piece of information results in yet another connection between the client and the web server. So by using these keeper lives, it's a good idea. It prevents these additional connections, so it's certainly recommended that you leave this box checked. Now finally, we could also choose to expire content on our website if that's applicable to your type of business. For example, let's say you're in the media and you need to refresh your articles daily, or maybe you trade in shares and you need to refresh the share prices at specific intervals. Well, you can configure that sort of thing here. So if we enable this setting, then the first option we have here is to expire web content immediately. Now, this will tell the browser not to cache any data at all, and this would be most useful when your site has a page with dynamically changing content, such as when a script dynamically builds the page. Now, this means that each time the user comes to your site, they're going to get a fresh page each and every time. And you can be sure that it's not being cached, so it's always going to be up to date. Now, if we choose to expire after a certain period of time, and that can be in days, hours, minutes, and seconds, this allows us to set the content to expire at a specific time, or the final option down here is where we can set the content to expire at a specific time and date of your choice. Again, it's all pretty self-explanatory. Now, our last option here is configuring MIME types, and this is where we can specify a list of file types that are able to be served as static content by this server, and this list is pretty comprehensive, as you can see. And it's really only likely that you'll change things here if you're using a custom in-house application that uses a non-standard file extension. Now, the final option that's probably worth talking about here in this video is that of compression, and if we double click on that, you'll notice that only static content will be compressed by default, and this enables IIS to compress files on the server and then send the compressed content to the client, and that'll save bandwidth. Now once the client receives that compressed content, it's uncompressed by the browser and then just displayed as normal. Now compressing dynamic content, on the other hand, isn't switched on by default, but if you do want that sort of stuff to be compressed, then it's as simple as checking this box. So that's websites on IIS 7. Really, when you look back, not much has changed here from IIS 6, although at a glance it certainly looks like everything's completely different. It's really only been given a new coat of paint with the new console, and it's missing a few wizards, but apart from that, fundamentally the nuts and bolts are exactly the same. It's also backwards compatible with IIS 6, which means that moving your websites and your applications over to IIS 7 is not really a difficult process. So give IIS 7 a go if you haven't already. I'm sure that you'll find the security and the reliability improvements since IIS 6 are enough to make you consider moving your sites to Windows 2008 if they aren't there already. We hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for supporting Winstructor.